I'm really excited now to be able to bring out our next panel of people, and it's going to be a great opportunity, I think, to talk about not just how we engage students, but how do the different policymakers that we have represented here at Education Commission of the States actually interact with each other. We want to continue to focus on the power of relationships and high expectations, but with a slight pivot for each of you on what does that mean for a state leader. The Education Commission of the States is unique in that we work across all of your role groups. Our commissioners are governors and their staff, state legislators, chief state school officers, school board members, state higher education executive officers, and more. And we see daily that these groups mean well, but don't always communicate. I get the joy of being in many of your states, and I love when we pull all 6 or 7 of our commissioners together, and you all know each other, and I hear the same thing. It's almost cliche for our state relations team because one of you says, wow, we haven't all been together since the governor's holiday party. And those interactions are important if you're going to see the successes that you need. So today we are taking a unique approach to hear directly from 4 state education leader role groups and to hear specifically how the role groups connect for success. Please join me on stage as I announce you now. First off, we have our new chair with his gavel, Pennsylvania Governor Tom Wolf. And again, we're honored to have him as our chair. Our second panelist, and I'm very excited to have her joining us because Shirley Weber, Assemblywoman from California, could not make a flight last night, and so she wasn't able to make it. And we're really honored to have Idaho Representative Wendy Horman join us. She didn't know she was going to be on this panel till 9 o'clock last night. So please join me in welcoming Wendy Horman. Wyoming State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Jillian Balow, has been a great leader and on our executive committee for a while. She wasn't with us yesterday because Wyoming actually officially opened their brand new Capitol, and she was able to be there for the christening of that, which doesn't happen very often for those of you in state government. Please join me in welcoming Jillian Balow to the stage. And last but not least, I'm very excited to have representing higher education, Daniel Greenstein, who is the Chancellor of the Pennsylvania State System for Higher Education and has been an education advocate for years. So we've done a little bit of planning for this discussion, and what we really want to have is...
We have?
You didn't get that memo? We're really trying to talk a little bit more about how do you interact better, and what do you need in your role group from the other 3 role groups to do your job well. And so the first question we want to ask, and we'll throw it to you first, Governor Wolf, since you didn't get the memo. What do you really need as governor from the other 3 role groups here to achieve more student success and greater impact on education policy?
Well, I think you mentioned it just a minute ago. What I need is people gathering together across these barriers, these boundaries that we've artificially set up in state government to talk to each other. And that's what we do. Dan, of course, is the Chancellor of the Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education. And he comes to Pennsylvania from the Gates Foundation, has a tremendous resume. And I got him because I said, what we're going to do is talk about education. And so we meet once a month in my office. And we're always talking about things that we can do. And I think just bringing people together across the education, what you do here at ECS is really important because we need to talk to each other more. There are a lot of great ideas. We just can't afford to lock them in people's heads.
Representative Horman?
Well, we didn't coordinate this, but I would also add a communication at the very top of my list, a culture of open communication. We've heard the Drucker quote that culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? So that culture of open communication. Legislatures are unique in most states. I think they set the budget. And we really shouldn't be doing that in isolation of evidence of what is needed. And so be honest with us. Give us the no-spin data. We develop crud filters pretty quickly in politics. So give us the no-spin data. Give us a vision of where we are and where we can go. And then take advantage of those varied voices. I think legislatures in many, if not most states, are part-time citizen legislatures. And so that's a rich, varied voice. I think you mentioned yesterday that your background in business was as valuable to you in your current role as, many, many things. And we can bring that conversation to the table as well. And I think that can, in the right culture of open and honest communication, can be a real advantage to the system.
Well, ditto. And I would also add, just reiterate what Senegal said, that one of the most important things that we can do as policymakers is to remember that our common vision is really about the young people in our communities and our love for the young people in our communities. So specifically to the different roles that we play, and from my perspective, we rely on the governor's office for a spotlight and for some street credibility sometimes. We rely on the legislature for that carrot and stick, and oftentimes the appropriation and your ability to move things over the finish line. And we really rely on preschool and higher education to lend depth and breadth to any education issues so that our stakeholders see it not just as a K-12 issue, not just as a higher ed issue, but we all have political capital, and it's easy to burn, and it's not so easy to earn. And so when we pool our political capital together as policymakers with that common vision and that common love for students, it really helps us get places we didn't know we could go before, which boils down to relationships.
That's great. So I can see you did not ask us this question to generate vigorous debate, because there's going to be a lot of agreement. So quick, just context setting, the state system in Pennsylvania is 14 universities, 90,000 students, kind of spread all over what is apparently a very large state and very diverse state. So that factors into, I guess, my response. So what I need from the governor is exactly the meetings that you referred to. And let me just add a little flavor. The governor is shy in telling us that he has a PhD from MIT, so he's an educator at heart. And so these meetings are like a sort of an Oxford tutorial. And there's a lot of thought partnership that goes on, and then of course we explore the people that we know together in higher education. So it's collegial, but that thought partnership is actually critical, because together we're working to build strategies not just for reforming and transforming higher education, but also thinking about the political tactics of doing that within a complex political environment. From the assembly, from the legislators, because it's a state system with 14 universities, these universities are in districts, and of course the conversation I tend to have with an assemblyman or a senator is, save my university, and I can't really do that, because the system, universities survive and thrive because the system survives and thrives. So how do I help get the legislators to adopt a statewide view, even though their instincts are to do what's right for them in the districts, which I get. And then for the superintendents, because we serve a large low-income population, students of color, students who've been historically underserved, a lot of rural poor, quite frankly, you know this, we don't have a chance with those students unless we get to them at 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. And we have to work together to pull them through, and to not be kind of to divide ourselves up between, as you said, between school and between secondary and higher education, to create a seamless pipeline. So that collaboration and communication is critical at all those levels.
So we chose these states. We chose Pennsylvania because Governor Wolf's coming in as our chair. But we chose these states and these leaders for particular reasons, because in our outreach that we've done across the country, there are some states where you can see that collaboration is a component that is used daily. And there are other states where you can't. We actually use a very scientific litmus test for our state relations on whether policies will move, and that is, can the governor and the chief state school officer have a drink together? And I mean that honestly, because in some states they can, and in some states it's not that simple for
We just did
different
last night, actually.
Oh, that's good, yeah. So how many of you in the audience think in your state you have the kind of culture that allows for that communication and collaboration? between governor and legislature and the chief and the SHIO? Raise your hand if you think you have that in your state. Yeah, it's maybe a third or so, and that's not a.
I'm not so sure.
It's not a bad thing. I hope Pedro from Pennsylvania raised his hand. The collaborative part there is an interesting one because that takes, as Jillian had said, it takes political capital to do that. It takes a requirement that people from different parties, from different beliefs, from different areas are actually going to reach out and expose themselves for the greater good of the students that they're hoping to impact. So the question I'd ask next is kind of, what are the examples of some of that collaboration that you've seen, or what are the ideal types of collaboration that have helped to make it work? I know, Governor Wolf, you've done that within the cabinet on setting up that.
Yeah, well, I think it starts with a recognition that we have a problem. And we can spend a lot of time doing useless things like trying to assign blames to who's responsible for our problem, but it's our problem. And so we've got to do something about that. And I think we have a demographic trough. So higher education, whether you're private or public, all across the country is looking at what can we do to make ourselves more relevant, more appealing to students. What can we do to integrate our mission to the needs of a 21st century economy, where not everybody needs to be a major in political science? What do we need to do to reach back into primary, secondary education to make sure that we have some seamless opportunity? And what can we do to make sure that 55-year-old person who has just been made redundant in her job, what can we do for that person to say, no, this is for you. We have this system. And I think the first thing is to say, okay, let's get out of denial. Let's recognize that we have a problem. And it's a shared problem. It's something that's not anybody's fault. It's not your problem. It's not mine. It's all of our problems. And if we figure this out, we're going to be in a really, really good place. So I think the first thing is to say, let's acknowledge that we have a problem.
I couldn't agree more with that. I think
One of these times we're going to disagree on something.
well, there's a reason they ask a Republican and a Democrat, right? Education governance in the United States is very stratified compared to most of the top global performers. And so that always leads us to the question of who's in charge. And I bet everyone on this stage might say, oh, it's me. And we don't even have any school board members or superintendents or teachers up here yet, right? And so that stratification can, it's an opportunity and a challenge. I mean, it's an opportunity if we can get all of the voices at the table, those diversified voices at the table. The challenge is, and I'm going to use an example from a presentation I saw last week from a superintendent in small rural Idaho. He put a picture up in front of a governor's task force that's trying to come up with a plan for a 5-year plan for education in Idaho. Everyone's around the table, but he put a picture of a finish line at a marathon. And then he put a picture of a rowing team next to it. And he said, in the marathon, each one person can cross the finish line and say, oh, I won. But you can't do that on a rowing team. And so that really is the challenge, is how do we all be rowing in our various roles across the spectrum. I started a fine arts program in my children's elementary school a long time ago. And we were studying Impressionism and Monet. And the lesson I taught, I created a poster board that covered the painting, and I just created several little windows. And I opened it, and I would ask the children, what's this a painting of, right? By showing them just a small portion of water lilies. And they couldn't answer it until the full poster came off, and you could see the masterpiece. Well, that's exactly how we create a masterpiece, is not by looking at individual windows, but by getting all on the same page and rowing together.
Yeah. Well, again, just reiterating what Senegal said about being engaged in education at different levels. Some days it might not feel like a parent is engaged in policy making or in policy discussions, but they absolutely are by the values that they hold and that they pass on to their children. And I think the same is true when we recognize that we're policymakers and when we come from a place of it's not so much about what we have the authority to do or not do, but it's more about the perspectives that we bring to the table to make a meaningful difference. And so often in our states, all of our states, we go straight to governance. And if only this changed in our governance structure, we could get this accomplished. But really, there is no one governance structure that works best. It's about the people who are leveraging the different aspects of the governance structure to make sure that the work gets done and that we stay engaged. I think there are lots of examples of great collaboration and lots of examples of no collaboration whatsoever. And I think it's important for all of us to realize that there's always overlap in what we do. Even though we always have common ground, even though we always want some of the same, sometimes that overlap can lead to or start with divergent opinions, and sometimes almost always it's very unclear what that overlap is and how to wade through that. And when the opinions are divergent, how to work through divergent opinions to maintain that common ground and really move forward.
Yeah, and I guess I'd just add another perspective on the same, another lens on the same problem, I guess. So the first thing is that in the collaborative, I think a number of voices that would need to be included that aren't represented here, but one of them would be the voice of employers, right? Because in effect, they're pulling our students through their demand if we're supply, sorry to phrase it that way, but, and that's absolutely critical. I think the other thing, and I'm challenged by this, and just as a strategic issue, the solutions to the challenges that we're talking about are immensely local, right? Students are local, jobs are local, education happens locally. But the problems are systemic, right? They happen at a statewide level. And so you have this disconnect between, the activity that happens on the ground locally, which may be more or less well-formed in these, we can all point to great examples of local collaboration across sectors and weaker examples. But the connectivity with any connection that happens at the state level, if there is any connectivity at the state level, that itself is unusual, but then the connectivity between the two would always be very weak. And how do you bridge those two critical lenses? Because the funding flows are essentially happening at the statewide level, and that's what's going to determine the capability on the ground to solve some of these problems. So connecting those two things is really going to be the challenge, or one that I see.
At our winter commissioners meeting in New Orleans back in December, we talked about the impact of the elections and the dramatic number of new faces who are going to be coming into many of these positions dealing with education policy. We know that about 40% of our governors have less than 7 months experience on the job right now. We know that we've had about 45% of our chiefs who've turned over within the last year, a large number of new legislators. And one of the things we discussed at that plenary session was, how do you start those relationships with the new people who are coming into those positions in your state, even if you know that you may not have the same opinions on what needs to be done for education? And how have the four of you kind of started those conversations and moved? I mean, all four of you, Dan's relatively new for this group as far as how long he's been in his service, but the rest of you have been there for at least 4 years. And how have you opened those doors with the new players? Because without that communication, you will have very stratified opinions and probably some limited successes at best.
No, you guys first. I think we're talking about collaboration. We've got to work together. Again, as I said yesterday, I've been in politics in this office now a little over 4 years. I was not in politics before that. But it's the same in the private sector as the public sector. One of the most intensive things about human beings is that we all hate change. And we all hate to actually stand up and do something different. And the public sector is no different from the private sector. So one of the things that we have to do is confront the reality that in the big organizations that we're trying to move in whatever direction we want to move them, they're primed to say, okay, you're going to be here for 8 years at the most. And if I duck and keep my head down and not do anything, I'm going to be in a much better place than if I do what you're asking me to do, which is stand up and just simply say, well, here's what we ought to do in my opinion. No one has ever asked for that, and no one really wants to give that, because that's a dangerous thing in any big organization. So I think one of the things that is nice about coming in from the outside and being relatively new is you don't know that. And you can ask really stupid questions and say, well, what do you really think? and those kinds of things are really important, I think, right now in education, because we've got to think differently about what we're doing and what we want to end up, where we want to end up. And I think we have to start with, again, that sort of naivete that says, okay, let's take the walls down. Let's take the barriers down, get out of the silos, and just start talking to each other honestly. It's a big risk. I understand that. But we have to start taking those risks or we're not going to move on.
I agree, and I think Jillian you mentioned earlier about the importance of relationships. I mean, it only took me one session of serving on the Appropriations Committee to realize that January was way too late to be learning the detailed level about those higher ed and K-12 budgets that I needed. And so my second session, I started going out. I went to each of our institutions, and I met with either the presidents or the vice presidents of finance, because I was new. And that was extremely helpful to me in developing those relationships. I previously served on a school board for 11 years before the legislature, and so those relationships I had all across the state with superintendents, school board members, and teachers, really invaluable. And so I do think it really boils down to just developing those relationships of trust, where you can have honest conversations so that the work you do ultimately helps students in the end.
Yeah. So even though I've been at this for almost 5 years, most days it feels like the movie 50 First Dates, and I'm at 5 years of first dates. And you know, to that end, I would say it's kind of easy to say build relationships, but what does that look like? So to break that down, you know, with all of the different stakeholders that are up here, policymakers up here, and those that aren't represented, as state superintendent, and again on my 5th year of First Dates, looking at where I know each of the stakeholders will have support and finding that common ground and starting the conversation there. So a great place to start, and they didn't even ask me to say this, is with the ECS reports, because those give you a really good idea of not just what's happening in your state, but what's happening in other states as well. And you can bet that if it's happening in a lot of states, that all of the people up here are thinking about that differently, and they're all getting support from their different organizations. And so while there's really no such thing as an easy win, it's an easier win when you pick a tough subject that you know you can all latch onto as policymakers and move forward together with differing perspectives and an appreciation for the fact that the debate that will ensue will create stronger policy for your state. And so that kind of breaks down maybe this is what building a relationship looks like. And I believe every one of us up here, every one of us in this room has the responsibility to not just find common ground through conversation, but find common ground through policy, through experience, through reports, and all of the means that we have at our fingertips.
Yeah, so for me, as the sort of new person coming into the state of Pennsylvania, it was obviously important to get out and visit campuses, the schools that sort of feed them, and the community colleges, and I've done that to a large extent. But the newer part for me was actually wandering around in the Capitol building. Now, I'm going to admit something. I spent the first 58 years of my life in a progressive blue bubble. And Pennsylvania's not that. And you know, you arrive and you get into the Capitol building in Dorothy, you're not in Kansas anymore, and it was, you know, kind of an interesting moment. But it's been super interesting to sort of go around to senators and to assembly folks and just start with a conversation about our children and their future and the future of the state, and to identify that there are an enormous sort of bipartisan interest in the subject that we're all passionate about. And then, you know, of course, it gets a little more difficult as you begin to get into the how to address the challenges. But there it's been, and I've really taken a leaf out of the governor's book, and with his encouragement, really start the conversation just with the data. And not, here's what the data mean to me, but the question, what do the data mean to you, and what should we do about them? And then to listen actively and to learn in that process. And, you know, hopefully through that process to not just build relationships, but also to identify paths through which it's possible to navigate to policy solutions, you know, which satisfy the broadest possible range of stakeholders in a very complex political environment.
Yesterday, we talked about some of the state policies where states are truly leading the way. And it's interesting if you look at some of those little nuggets of policies that I talked about where the collaborative effect really had to happen. I mean, Louisiana couldn't start mandating a FAFSA form be filled out before you graduate high school without a whole lot of work across the entire state of education and of implementation. In the District of Columbia, they couldn't have had 89% of their 4-year-olds enrolled in a high-quality pre-K without a collaborative effect and everybody working together. The GI Bill would not have passed with a Republican legislature and a Democratic governor that you have the first ever statewide GI Bill for your Pennsylvania National Guards people. And even Boot Up Wyoming, Jillian, I mean, that can't happen across your state without the support of everybody in the Capitol, but a host of people across the rest of the state. So it's impressive kind of the impact that some of those have had, and I'd urge you to look at how that collaborative effect led to those success stories for the states. It wasn't just one person having one good idea and getting one bill passed. At the Education Commission of the States, we really want to be your assistant in bringing that collaborative effect into the state, because I think there's a really, really impressive opportunity with some of the task forces that a few of you have set up. James Lane from Virginia, who's the Chief State School Officer, talked about their Virginia is for learners, not Virginia is for lovers at our business meeting. And those are examples of where they actually brought in everybody who absolutely did not agree about things and put them all at the same table to start discussing issues like equity. And so as you continue to look at your states and where you're going to go, I hope that you will take advantage of our services and take advantage of your fellow commissioners and your fellow steering committee members here at ECS who are encouraged to do the exact same thing. So please join me in thanking our panel for their wisdom